Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video. Today, what I want to talk about is we're going to start a discussion about disclosures, about the forms themselves, about your best practices, about the importance of clarity and transparency in the disclosures. I know that there's some hesitancy sometimes from both agents and sellers on wanting to disclose, but the benefit with the more disclosure you make is that you're more protected. So a lot of times, and I see this a lot in counteroffers specifically, is property sold as is, which is fair, but the contract, like we've discussed a number of times in the past, already states that the property is sold as is. That as is, though, is dictated by the disclosure made by the seller. So the more you disclose, the more as is the property is being delivered to the buyer. So basically what happens is if I have, for example, I had a conversation with an agent yesterday that mistakenly, and we're going to talk about this in the TDS in a moment, checked off a box for additional inspection reports and disclosures that is part of the TDS. With that, what you're supposed to do is attach any disclosures or reports or other things that you may have. So for example, in this case, this is a flip for him. And when he purchased it, he did a home inspection, and he didn't purchase it long ago. He had a home inspection report. When he checked off that box and didn't send anything because he checked that by mistake, not knowing that he should be sending that home inspection report with his TDS, the buyer's agent rightfully said, okay, well, if you check that by mistake, then we need a new transfer disclosure, or send me the report if you have one. So when I spoke to him yesterday, he said, well, do I just do a whole new TDS? What do I do? And I said, well, if you have the home inspection report, because he mentioned it, just send the home inspection report, and then you're compliant with what was checked off on that TDS. You don't have to revise it. And you're better protected because now you're disclosing even more things because you're disclosing stuff that you may not have known. But for all of us as listing agents, when we're in a transaction where, for example, we had a buyer that canceled and now we're back into escrow, any of those reports, which we're supposed to receive from the buyer, right? The home inspection report or appraisals, depending, any report that you may have that came as part of a previous escrow, it's in your best interest to include that in your disclosures because now it expands that as is, right? So it expands that. And if, for example, you don't have a copy of a report, but a buyer's home inspection exposed some kind of defect in the property that they asked for in a request for repairs, and then I move into a new transaction, if that defect isn't part of my transaction or part of my disclosures, then I'm not disclosing fully. So you have some choices, right? That defect may have been found as part of a home inspection. If you have a copy of that home inspection, you connect it to the TDS, and now you're protected. But if you don't disclose it, but you knew about it because you found out in a previous transaction, you could be leaving yourself open to some non-disclosure issues and some problems with the buyer. Okay, so it's important that we understand and do things the right way with disclosures. We'll probably talk about this again as we get into the form, but I want to just kind of like preface that I think sometimes we take the whole disclosure process as more of a nuisance than an important necessity in the process of the transaction. So before I share my screen and we jump into the forms, does anybody have any questions? You can go ahead and raise your hand or type it in the chat. Anybody? All right, then let's get started. Let me share my screen with you guys. So you should be looking at right now the transfer disclosure. And let's start looking at the nuts and bolts of the form. So if this, and the very first thing is there, if this property is a duplex, triplex, or fourplex, a TDS is required for all units. This TDS is for all units, or check only units, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it is. My suggestion is, if you have 2, 3, 4 units, you should have multiple TDSs. One TDS can cover the exterior, especially if it's just one building. For example, if you have 2 or 3 units that are one building and share the same, front and backyard or whatever the case may be, you can use one for one unit and the entire outside of the building, and then one for each additional unit. That's how you should be doing your transfer disclosure. I think what happens is again, we like to take shortcuts. So we'll say this TDS is for all the units. It's very difficult, especially if there's 3 or 4 units. There's going to be different issues for every unit that you have to disclose. And I don't know that necessarily that there's going to be a clearer way to do that. So I would suggest you do multiples. If you don't want to, though, you can. Just make sure you're clearly disclosing everything. Now, this disclosure statement is the seller's statement of disclosure, not you, the agent. So that means the seller's answering all these questions. One of the things I feel like is the biggest issue for listing agents and these disclosures is they're not involved in the process of filling these out. We've disconnected ourselves from it, whether you're using an assistant or a transaction coordinator, or you're just leaving the form with the seller and leaving them to their own devices. We've disconnected ourselves from the process. The danger in that is that as we're looking at all of these, is that this is where most disputes come from, where lawsuits after the fact, where there's, an issue between buyer and seller, they stem from the clarity in these disclosures. So then when we're disconnected from it as the listing agents, where we should be the person guiding the seller through it, we're putting ourselves in a position where, we're opening it up to an issue. Okay. So my suggestion is that when the seller is going to be answering the questions on any of these disclosures, the TDS, the SPQ, that you're there and you're guiding them through it. Okay. Because if you have anybody else doing it, like, hey, if a transaction coordinator is doing it for you, that's a business decision you've made, but their license isn't on the line because they don't have one. Okay. If your assistant is doing it, they don't have a license most of the time. Their license is not on the line when the information is incorrect. And the process, the service that we're providing to a seller that they're paying us for getting their home sold, I mean, they're not paying you for putting it on the MLS and holding an open house. They're paying you for protecting them. That's really what your job is to guide them through a transaction and protect them. They could put their house up and still get offers. They don't need you for that. Okay. This disclosure statement concerns the real property situated in the city of, right? So this is just the address for the property. This statement is a disclosure of the condition of the above described property in compliance with 1102 of the Civil Code as of the date that you're filling it out, right? That means this was the condition on this day. So if anything happened subsequently, or there was something that the buyer found out. So if, for example, we open escrow, I do a really complete transfer disclosure, you go and do your home inspection, and we find out something in that home inspection that I didn't know as seller. I am not required to change my disclosure based on the findings that the buyer comes up with during their inspections. Okay. Subsequent escrows, maybe. But for that transaction, no, that's it. I don't have to change it. Okay. It is not a warranty of any kind by seller or any agent representing any principals in this transaction and is not a substitute for any inspections or warranties the principals may wish to obtain. Coordination with other disclosure forms. The real estate transfer disclosure statement is made pursuant to 1102 of the Civil Code. Other statutes require disclosures depending upon the details of the particular real estate transaction. For example, special study zones or purchase money liens on residential property. Substituted disclosures. The following disclosures and other disclosures required by law, including the natural hazard disclosure statement that may include airport noises, earthquake, fire, flood, or special assessment information, have or will be made in connection with this real estate transfer and are intended to satisfy the disclosure obligations on this form where the subject matter is the same. So what they're saying is this. Because when we get to the questions, the question is, are you, the seller, aware of ... right? The following item in this transaction or in this questionnaire. If the seller is unaware of it, like this said, airport annoyances, earthquake, fire, flood, assessments, things like that, if they're not aware of it, there are subsequent reports that we're going to do as part of the transaction, natural hazard disclosure, that we're going to do that will cover some of those items and protects the seller as if they made that disclosure. Okay. So if there were any inspection reports completed pursuant to the contract of sale or receipt for deposit. So the contract of sale is the RPA. So if prior to getting the offer, this property is in Compton or Southgate or any of the other number of cities that do pre-sale inspection reports. If this property is in one of those areas and I've gotten that inspection report already, which now makes it part of the purchase agreement, right? Because it's a requirement. I can check this box and make that part of the TDS, deliver it from the beginning, deliver it with all the disclosures at the beginning. This additional inspection reports or disclosures, if I have a previous home inspection that was done by another buyer in a previous transaction that canceled, I can attach that home inspection to this transaction, to this TDS, and make it part of my disclosures. If I have one of my own, right? If the seller have done a professional home inspection because I didn't know what the true condition of my property was, I can attach that one. Now, I would suggest, and I've made this suggestion for many years, if you have a seller that is an absentee owner, has not lived in the property for many years, has rented it, or is a vacation home, or whatever the case is, where they don't spend a lot of time in there and they're not sure that they understand all of the condition of that property, my suggestion is you have them pay for a professional home inspection and you attach it to the TDS. Now, that as is, that disclosure is much stronger because not only is it the questions I'm going to answer with my own knowledge of what's happening in the property, but now I have a third-party professional home inspection attached that's showing you all the defects. So now there's where that as is gets expanded because there is no hidden defect, right? Because sellers don't know everything about their property. And that's why we suggest buyers do a home inspection, because even the seller who wants to be as transparent as possible and tell you everything they could possibly know about the property, they don't know 100%. And that's why things always come out in home inspections, right? Little things, but things come out because the seller wasn't aware of them to disclose them. Or if you don't have any of those things, you have no additional reports that you're attaching as part of this transfer disclosure, then you would check the box that says no substituted disclosures for this transfer. Okay. Questions on section 1 here? Anybody? Hands up. Something in the chat? No? All right. Seller's information, section 2. This is where the seller is going to Answer these questions. The seller discloses the following information with the knowledge that even though this is not a warranty, prospective buyers may rely on this information deciding whether and on what terms to purchase the subject property. Seller hereby authorizes any agents representing any principals in this transaction to provide a copy of this statement to any person or entity in connection with any actual or anticipated sale of the property. So anybody that could be a potential buyer, we're telling you, give them a copy of this. Now, one thing that I would suggest that maybe people start adopting, and this is recently had a conversation with an agent that now is having an issue with their disclosures because one of the sellers is not readily available, but they didn't try to fill out their disclosures until they were already in escrow. So now what it does is it puts their back against the wall because they have limited time to deliver disclosures and they have a seller that's being difficult. Had they started this process the day they took the listing, trying to get this difficult seller to sign disclosures and fill out disclosures, they wouldn't be feeling the time crunch. And one of the things that you can do, if you take the time to get all your disclosures completed prior to opening an escrow, you can attach all your disclosures to a counteroffer and have people approve and return the disclosures with the counter. And now you don't have that piece of the timetable that you have to concern yourself with. Yeah, in the chat, somebody said, for best practice, do we have these disclosures done as soon as we get the listing? Absolutely. Like, if you want to do it, you could do it the day you take the listing. If you go on the listing appointment and take the listing and you want to sit there with them for a couple hours and do the disclosures that day, go for it. But make an appointment as soon as you get that listing. The next thing before you leave that house should be, let's set an appointment for me to come over and do disclosures, or for us to meet at the office and go through the disclosures. That should be the next step, okay? The following are representations made by the seller and are not the representations of the agents, if any. The importance of the if any is because this disclosure is required whether they're for sale by owner or they're listed with an agent, with a broker. Okay? So this information is disclosure and is not intended to be part of any contract between the buyer and seller. So what that means by not a contract is that it's not, I mean, it's part of the transaction, obviously, but it's not it's not dependent on this. This is just me giving you the information. It's not like the purchase agreement says, well, this includes the TDS or doesn't. It's a disclosure that's required to be given. The seller is or is not occupying the property. This little box that you're checking here does not change the disclosure requirement. All this is just information to say, hey, we live there or we don't live there, but it doesn't change what you're required to disclose. So even if you put is not occupying the property, it doesn't say, well, now my hands are clean, I don't have to disclose anything. Okay? Let's see. Alba, you had a question. Go ahead.
Hi, Kyle. So you mentioned that if they have a professional inspection done on the property, I'm just trying to see if it's, for you to clarify, they don't have to fill this out, the seller's information, or
no. They still have to fill this out.
okay.
They're just attaching it and they're giving more information than even they might have known. But you still have to fill this out. You still have to go through this. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. So seller is or is not doesn't change their duty of disclosure. It just is informational, saying, hey, we did live here or we didn't. That's it. Okay. The subject property has the items checked below. I'm going to jump ahead because there's a little asterisk right here, right? So let's jump ahead to that asterisk where it says C note on page 2. And where is that? It is, installation of a listed appliance, device, or amenity is not a precondition of sale or transfer of the dwelling. So if by chance somebody accidentally checks one of these things and the property doesn't have it and you don't catch it, okay, let's just say that by chance I check off microwave, and I don't have I don't have a built-in microwave. Okay. It doesn't then require me to install a microwave because I put it on here. And just because I check something off here, so for example, let's say that the range, the oven, right, that item, I'm taking it with me. But I still check it off because the subject property has these items checked below. As long as my purchase agreement says those things aren't staying, this doesn't make them stay. But if you're taking them, please advise your client to not check them off because it does cause confusion. Okay? Just we're trying to be clear. So the TDS changed over the years, and it used to, instead of going up and down, it used to go in order left to right, right? So it was like it would be range, oven, microwave, dishwasher. It went that order. Now they have it this way, right? Everything runs from top to bottom. So it makes a little bit more sense as you're going through these things and answering the questions. One of the issues we have, like I just mentioned, where you check something off because it says the subject property has items checked below. If we're not involved in the seller answering the questions, right, they might check off range and oven because it has it, even if they're planning on taking it. And like I said, we don't want to cause that confusion. So us being involved, we could say, hey, oh, we have a range. Yeah, but let's not check it because we're taking it. We have an oven. Oh, but let's not check it because we're taking it. Okay? So be clear. And another thing that we are there for as our guidance and being good at is asking questions that people may or may not remember about the functionality or the condition of some of the items we're checking off here, right? We all at one point or another have owned or rented or lived somewhere where there was some kind of small issue with something that worked in our house, right? We had a stove where one of the burners didn't light. We had, the pilot light didn't work. We had to use a match, or the knob didn't work, or when you turned on the shower and the washer and dryer at the same time, the pipes rattled. But we got used to it, and we didn't think of it as being a nuisance any longer. So what we're doing as we're going through this stuff with the seller is we're guiding them as if they were a buyer, right? We're going to ask them questions about things that would be important to a buyer. So when we talk about Ranger oven, are there any issues with the Ranger oven? Like, yeah, it has it, but are there any problems? Is there anything wrong with it? Do any of the burners not work? Does the oven not reach the right temperature? Any of those things, right? We have to ask those questions. Dishwasher, does it leak? Does that water come out of the top of that little thing that's next to the sink? So as we're going through each of these things, we have to ask them that question. Now, when we get down to something like rain gutters, my preference would be that we guide the sellers into saying, if they don't have rain gutters around the entire perimeter of the roof, they only have it in a portion, then you got to disclose that. Okay? So that's our job as we're going through these things, is not to just let our sellers go, oh yeah, I have that, I have that, I have that, I have that. It's also to find out if there's any issues, because down here at the bottom, are there, to the best of your seller's knowledge, any of the above that are not in operating condition? Now, operating condition sounds like it works. I don't care if there's a problem. I don't care, because we have to think about it from a buyer. A buyer is going to think it's not operating properly if it's not operating at 100%, and we all know that. We all know that. So when we try to use those semantic arguments like, hey, it operates, does it work well? No, but it operates. That's not going to work, and we all know that hands-off method does not work with buyers. If there's a problem with any of those things and we fail to disclose it and we knew about it, it's going to be an issue for us or our sellers in the future. And our job is to make sure they're protected. And in turn, that protects us because we've protected them. Because if something goes wrong with this disclosure and it turns out that the seller has to pay damages because of it, or it costs them money after the fact, you better believe they're going to turn around and look at us to be reimbursed for that cost that it cost them. They're going to hold us as responsible, if not more. And it's true. And so this becomes one of the dangers of us having a third party like a TC or an assistant be the one that helps guide the sellers through the disclosures, because most of the time, if it's your transaction coordinator, I would say probably 100% of the time. If it's your assistant, it's probably 99% of the time. They have never seen the property. They don't know the condition of the property. They don't know if it has a trash compactor. They don't know what works or what doesn't. They don't know what it has. So it's hard for them to give any kind of guidance to your seller, right? If the seller makes a mistake and says, hey, arrange an oven, if your assistant or if the transaction coordinator who wasn't involved in the negotiation doesn't know that that item's not staying and they check it off, could it cause an issue between the buyer and seller? Absolutely. That's why it's imperative that you guys are involved in some way with these disclosures, because you're the ones who have been through the property. My advice is that I may want to do my AVID, right, my agent's visual inspection disclosure, and that would be the next form we're going to talk about, maybe before I even walk them through the TDS, because I may see some things that I could remind them of, like, oh, you sure that the rain gutters are okay? There's no broken ones. There's no, the downspout is not. Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm not going to tell them, hey, I saw this, put it on, but I'm going to know the things that I may need to remind them of so that they can make the disclosure. Is that fair? So I know it's tedious, and it feels like, I know that we pushed you guys, go out there and sell, You got a prospect, this kind of, but this right here is money and potentially your license if we don't do it properly. Okay. So that's why I really try to stress that you guys are involved with this disclosure process. Okay. So they're going to check off any of these things that may exist and answer these questions about if there's exhaust fans and fireplaces and what kind of roof, if they know, and the approximate age of that roof. They're going to put all that stuff in. And if there's anything wrong with them, I don't care if it works, but if there's anything wrong, if there is any defect with any of these above items that have been checked off, any of these things, then you're going to put yes, and you're going to write whatever that is. The seller is going to write whatever that is in there. Okay? If there is not enough space because it's only 2 lines, they have them put C addendum there, because as you can see, I can't type. And then, or you can handwrite if there is not room, you put C addendum, and then you do an addendum number 1 to the transfer disclosure and list all of the defects. Yes, Virginia, go right ahead.
Hi, Kyle. So I've had a few problems with this because I guess maybe I was misdirecting my sellers, because I guess to clarify, anything that's going to stay with the property, then it is best to make sure that that is written on the RPA then.
Yeah. No, what do you, yes, of course. If
so
it's,
go ahead.
If it's a personal item, right, which as long as the stove and the ovens and those things aren't built in to the kitchen cabinets, then yes, if it's going to stay, it has to be addressed in the RPA.
Because like a refrigerator, for example, I don't necessarily put it in there if they don't have it identified, but there's been times where they'll tell me at the end, oh, the refrigerator is staying. But all these items need to be clarified on the RPA. We don't reference here on the TDS.
No. If, for example, like you just said, hey, they'll tell me last minute, oh, it's staying. The problem with that is that even if they talked to the buyer, let's say they met the buyer at the home inspection or some point, and they said, oh, you know what? Is it okay if we're going to leave you guys the refrigerator? Are you cool with that? And the buyer's like, yeah, sure. But you don't put it in writing anywhere. And then later when they get there, they find out, well, I don't really like this refrigerator, or it's not working great or whatever. And now I didn't agree to leave it here in the contract. Now they could turn around and say, hey, the seller's left personal items and debris, and I need you guys to pay to get rid of it. So
Yeah.
if that's the case, if later on the seller says, you know what, we had a conversation with the buyer and we're going to leave the refrigerator. Great. Guess what I'm going to do? Amendment of existing agreement terms. Buyer and seller agree that the refrigerator is staying with the property.
Gotcha.
Now there's never a question, not just referencing it here.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. Let's see. Bertha was next. Go ahead, Bertha.
Okay, so you just said like the seller has to be the one writing on this form, but
Yes.
sometimes they don't want to do it. They said, "Can you
No, too
please
bad.
help me?"
No,
Because they don't
you-
speak. They
but-
don't know how to write in English. So
Okay.
it happens.
So here's an issue that you have. If they can't write in English, then have them write the answers in Spanish, or you have to have an interpreter translator because you can't fill it out. I mean, you shouldn't write in Spanish because the chances are the buyer can't read it. They should have somebody in their family, 18 or over, or a friend 18 or over, that signs the interpreter translator addendum, and they can fill this out for them. But you shouldn't be touching it, because guess what happens? If there's a problem with something and it turns into a lawsuit because, or, you know, a dispute because of the issue that's in here, all the seller has to say is, I didn't fill it out, Bertha did. I don't even speak English. I didn't know what was in there. And guess who's going to be responsible for all the damages? Bertha.
Will that apply to all disclosures?
Yes.
Oh wow.
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I try to, and I know this is not about disclosure. Thank you, Bertha, for your question, because I'm sure other people had this question too. But if it's Spanish, if they can't write or read English, there needs to be an interpreter translator as part of the transaction for everything. Everything. And I say this to you guys because it's the absolute 100% right thing to do. I know you're all going to choose to do your own thing, and I'm okay with that. That's your choice, because I'm on video saying you must have an interpreter translator involved in your transaction who is 18 or over and provided by the seller, not by you. Because if I have a seller that doesn't speak or read English and I'm the one who's translating everything in there, guess what I've just done? I've taken on 100% of the liability of this transaction. So if a buyer comes back and says there's anything was wrong with that transaction and goes after the seller's just going to say, I had no idea. My agent told me this. I don't read English or speak English, so they told me everything in Spanish. I just assumed they were doing what I told them. So guess what? You just took responsibility for all of the seller's stuff. Even during the listing agreement and listing presentation, yes, especially during the listing agreement and listing presentation, they should have an interpreter there that's provided by them, whether it is family or not, that is 18 and over and signs the interpreter translator addendum. I know that you guys aren't going to do it. I get it. I know you're not. I hope that you start to do it. But that's especially when you're taking a listing, this person is committing to paying you a commission to sell their house. If something goes wrong and they don't want to pay you, all they have to do is say, I didn't know I was signing to pay that. I thought I was paying some. He told me I was paying a different amount than what he put in the contract, and I can't read English, so I didn't know. So what happens is when they have an interpreter or a translator that sits there with them, you don't have to do your presentation in English and have them interpret it. You could do it in Spanish. All that interpreter is telling them is that what you're telling them in Spanish is what's written on the paper in English. But if they don't provide that interpreter, that you bring it, then it's you doing it still the same. That's why you have to say to them, listen, I understand that it's an extra person, but I would need for you guys to provide somebody that speaks and read English because you guys don't. Now, if your seller tells you, no, I read English, I'm not good at speaking it, but I can read it. All right, then have a little email interchange with them that says, hey, just clarifying before our appointment, you stated that you don't speak English, but you can read it clearly. Terrific. Now go do your your whole listing presentation in Spanish. You're cool. As long as they can read it, you're good. And if they state to you, yes, I can read this, then they can't come back and say I didn't know. Okay? Is that fair? So Yes, I want them to do this. Again, this is the same issue that you have when an assistant or your transaction coordinator does it, is you aren't there as part of the process, so you don't even know what the conversation is, but you still become liable for things that go wrong. So that's why I'm trying to urge to you guys to be involved in that process. Even if you want to make this part of the whole package of signings that your seller has to do, and you have your transaction coordinator or your assistant do that, be in the room so that you can at least discuss these parts, or when they have a question about what they're going through, you're there to refer to, not your transaction coordinator and not your assistant. Okay, so if there's no room for the yeses, addendum. Okay, now here's where we're going to answer questions. Are you, the seller, aware of any significant defects, malfunctions in any of the following? Yes or no. I feel like that's yes or no feels like it comes before the items. It's hard to say, well, yes, but without looking at what the items are. But, take a gander at what those things are before you check a yes. So are there any defects with the interior walls? Are there any defects with the ceilings, the floors, the exterior walls, the insulation, the roof, the windows, the doors, foundation, driveway, sidewalks, walls, fences, electrical, plumbing? That's why it's important that somebody guides them through this, has seen the property, because there's some things that they may not remember. They don't think about, like, they don't realize that there's a hole. They forgot that there's a hole from the doorknob in the bedroom, right? That's an interior wall defect, that there's a hole, or that there was a big crack in the wall, right? Now, they don't have to put there's a big crack in the wall, just put crack in the wall. But they forget the things that are there. Now, if there's the roof, especially, this is one of the things, like with the roof, you have to ask them, like with the roof and windows and foundations, you have to ask them, were there ever any problems that you repaired, right? Because they might say, oh no, the roof is fine right now, there's no problems with it. Okay, was there an issue with the roof that you had repaired while you were the owner? The reason I state this is because when, let's say you have a roof leak, unless they replace the entire roof, there's still going to be evidence of that roof leak in the attic as part of the roof, as the structural part of the roof. And if we don't put roof, there was a roof leak on this date and was repaired on this date, whatever. When they do home inspections, or if they do a roof inspection, they're going to say, oh, there was a leak here. And they're going to start to think that you're withholding something from them. Okay, so that's why these conversations need to happen. The agent needs to be part of that process. Okay. And here we go. If any of the above is checked, explain, attach additional sheets if necessary. Add the addendum again. Okay. Okay. So here we go with the question. C, are you, the seller, aware of any of the following? So if they're not, then clearly the answer is no. If they are, then it's yes, and we go down to the bottom and we explain what that is, what that yes means. So one is substances, materials, or products which be environmental hazard. The chances are your seller has no idea of any of these items, right? So the answer could clearly be no. But if for some reason they had something happen with the property where they're aware that there is mold or lead-based paint or chemical storage tanks, right? There's been people contaminated soil or water, like there's people that are aware of these things, because there's, they get notices from the county or the city or the state that, hey, we got to clean up the land, or whatever the fake case is, or they found out when they purchased the property. If they know, it's a yes. If they don't, it's a no. Features of the property shared in common with adjoining landowners, such as walls, fences, driveways, whose use or responsibility for maintenance may have an effect on the subject property. This one surprisingly gets a lot of no's, even though the majority of the houses we sell share a fence, right? Or a driveway or something like, right? There's some portion of the property that is shared, even though it's a single family residence that's detached. So again, eyes open. If my assistant is here in a conference room going through these disclosures with the seller, has never seen the property, and I'm the only one that has, and I'm not there to say, well, wait a minute, hold on a second, you guys have a wall that's, oh yeah, shoot, you're right, I forgot, I got to check yes. That's what we're here for, is to make sure they're doing things properly. Any encroachments, easements, or similar matters that may affect your interest in the property. If you don't know that you have an encroachment or an easement, which most sellers probably don't, because they just haven't gone through that issue, The answer is no. If you know what it is, then you have to disclose the whole issue and that you're aware of it. Room additions, structural modifications, or other alterations or repairs made without necessary permits. Straightforward. Like, again, us seeing the property, for those of us that have, experience, you can walk into a house and kind of notice, like, I don't think they permitted that room or that addition or that enclosed patio. And so you can ask that question, hey, by the way, was that enclosed patio permitted? No, it wasn't. Okay, can you check yes on here and can we put that down? Okay. Room additions, structural modifications, or other alterations or repairs not in compliance with building codes. Now, just because I say there are no permits, I check yes here, doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to check yes here. I could have everything be up to code, just didn't go through the process of getting it permitted. So this being a yes doesn't make this a yes. This being a yes, this absolutely has to be a yes. Does that make sense? Right? So, only one affects both. Let's see. In relationship to the language, if we become an official American translator, so certified with that minimum as the class, I no, because you're still benefiting yourself. You got to stay. There's still a conflict of interest there. Even if I'm a certified translator, they could still say, well, yeah, but you told me one thing because this benefited you to get this amount of commission or the sales price or whatever. No. It's always a third party, always. Okay. Note to C4 and C5, right? Those room additions. If the transfer acquired the property within 18 months of accepting an offer to sell it, transfer shall make an additional disclosure regarding the room addition, structural modifications, or other alterations or repairs on a seller property questionnaire. And we'll get into that, but probably not today. That'll be next Thursday. Okay. Any fill, compacted or otherwise, on the property or any portions thereof. That's, they put soil in to fill up a place. Like if anybody filled a pool or anything like that, that would be yes or no. They would know. If they didn't, that's a no. Any flooded drainage or grading problems, that's more just like, again, we all kind of have a place on our property where it doesn't quite drain right, where like it rains and water, and we're going to notice it in the next couple of days here, where water kind of pools up and stays for a little while. That would be a draining, even though it seems very minor, it could be major. Okay, I have an example. I sold a property to someone. The backyard hadn't been done for a very long time. The house had been redone, but the backyard wasn't. And the backyard wasn't graded properly. The seller did not make any disclosure, probably because it hadn't rained in a very long time at that time. It was like we were going through a drought and stuff. Not heavy rain anyway. The first heavy rain that buyer was living in the property, the water, instead of draining to the sides of the yard, all drained towards the patio. And the way the patio went, all the water that drained to the patio went right into the crawl space to the foundation of the house. Like huge, they looked like a little river of water. Sandbags, the whole thing. Luckily, that buyer wasn't litigious. They were just like, we're redoing the backyard anyway. They probably didn't know. We're not going to go after them. But could that have been an issue for the seller? Because they didn't make that disclosure of, by the way, when it rains, it drains right into the patio and sometimes into the crawl space. They didn't go after them because they said, we knew what the yard looked like. We're not going to go after them to get money, but they very well could have probably tried to do that. So even for some things that seem like maybe it's not a big deal, asking that question of them because they don't think about it. Sometimes there's been so much distance between something happening that they miss it. So if we just ask the question of when we get to 8, right? And we say, is there any flooding or drainage problems? You guys have any where water stays for a long time or where it doesn't drain properly? It might coax them into, oh, yeah, you know what? Yes, when it rains heavy, we get this puddle that stays there for about a week before it dries up. Great. Let's put yes and let's explain that. Okay. Now, if they still say no, then it's no. You can't be like, really? Come on. Nothing. Really? Your house is not right. It's just a prompt to get them to think about the property because we forget about stuff. We forget about things all the time. Hell, we forget about what's going on with our body. Like I got a bad knee, and then all of a sudden it doesn't remember until we walk up a stair or something, right? It's the same thing with your house. You live in it forever. You forget about the things that are happening because they don't really bug you anymore. You're so used to them, they just become the norm. Major damage to the property or any of the structures from fire, earthquake, floods, or landslides. Hey, if they've ever had a fire, they need to disclose it because, again, just like when your roof leaks, when there's a fire and that damage gets repaired from the fire, they don't replace all the wood, so there's still some evidence of that fire. And so if we don't disclose it, because they said, oh, we had a fire, we just repaired, we were remodeled everything. Some of the structure that was in the fire remains most of the time. And that means there will be some evidence that a fire did happen in that property. And if we don't disclose it, it's going to look like we were trying to hide it from them. Okay, any zoning violations, non-conforming uses, violations of setback requirements. Again, all of these things are just yes, no. Is your seller aware? Yes or no? And us being part of this when we're going through this is just a prompt. Hey, have you ever had anything? Is there any problems with the CCNRs? Are there any lawsuits like this one? Any lawsuits that are affecting the property? We have to ask that because even though title will look for anything that's there that are judgments or other lawsuits that may be affecting it already because they've been filed, we're asking that question: is there anything that is not going to show up yet that is potential? Okay. Again, if there was a yes to any of these things, we have to explain that yes. If there's not enough room to explain the yes, that goes on the addendum that we attached. Okay. The seller certifies that the property as the close of escrow will be in compliance with the health and safety code, having operable smoke detectors, which are approved, listed, and installed in accordance with state fire marshal's regulations and applicable local standards. The seller certifies that the property as the close of escrow will be in compliance with the health and safety code by having the water heater tanks braced, anchored, and strapped in place according to applicable law. We all know that. That's what they're going to do. Seller signs it. Okay. Bertha, yes, go ahead.
I have this listing where the seller explained there is a lien from the city, and we're gonna, take care of that through escrow. Do I have to disclose this?
Yes, I mean you should. They know about it. It's going to show up in the prelim. It's going to show up in the prelim anyway. But if you know about it ahead of time, it's always safe. The more you disclose is not bad. That's the thing, is that we have to start adopting that. The more disclosure is better for our sellers because there's less chance that someone's going to come and try to take all the money that they earn from selling their property. So the more disclosure, the better. Because even if it's in the prelim and they miss it, it still could turn into an issue, right? Because they're going to come back and say, oh, now we found out about this. Because let's be honest, those of you guys that are buyer's agents, how many of you go through the prelim with your buyers? I don't even see anybody trying to raise a hand or say, the sellers don't even, the listing agents don't even go through the prelim with the sellers, which is crazy to me. The amount of times that we've had a listing agent say, oh my God, we went to close and we found out there's this lien, but it was on the prelim. And they start trying to blame, well, title didn't take care of it and so didn't do it. You guys have to start learning how to review these things. And especially as a buyer's agent, here's the thing, as a buyer's agent and as a listing agent, the reason you have to review it is because if I review it as a listing agent, I have the seller to talk to. So if there's some kind of a lien or judgment or encumbrance on the property, I can say, hey, by the way, did you know about this? Because, we didn't include it in your net sheet. Oh my gosh, no, we paid that off. I had one where I was representing a buyer. The seller had paid off a mortgage in 1983. Okay. So I got it, the prelim, as a buyer's agent, and we see these things on there that there's a loan, whatever. It looks normal. It's not making the seller a short sale. So it's nothing that for me as a red flag, I go as buyer's agent, hey, let me call the listing agent and say, hey, are these liens, correct? Because they all look normal. It wasn't a tax lien. It wasn't anything like that. But the listing agent didn't review it. So we're getting ready to close, and the listing agent calls me and says, oh, there's that lien from 83. They paid that off, but that company's out of business. We need to get the the title doesn't want to close until they can get the reconveyance. And to get the reconveyance, they got to go have somebody go to a warehouse and look for a piece of paper to get the reconveyance. Now, luckily they did that. Luckily they did it. They found it. Right? They found it and we were able to close. But that's why it's so important that we do that. But I got sidetracked. Most people don't really dig into and I got a couple of people that say, I do. Great. You guys are terrific. Thank you for doing that because that's what you should be doing. But because some people miss it, it's in my best interest because I don't want later them to come back and say, hey, you guys didn't tell me X, Y, or Z. I'm going to let it go. I'm going to do it. Okay. Any kind of lawsuit, any kind of judgment, anything that's on there, even if we're going to pay it off, I want to make sure everybody's aware because sometimes those payouts for judgments, what do? They extend the escrows. Right? So, yeah, no, the TC did not catch it. Yeah, that's the thing is also the TC, we can't rely on our transaction. I know our transaction coordinators are there to back us up, but they can't be the one you point the finger at when something goes through on a prelim and you didn't find it. Okay, I'm sorry, Bertha, you must have had more. I cut you off. Go ahead.
Hey, isn't it that the lender has to provide the reconveyance once the loan is paid off? Do they always have
they
to
do,
pay after that?
and there was one, but for just some reason on that one from 1983, title didn't have a record of that loan being paid off. So it wasn't that it wasn't, it was just that record was lost, right? There wasn't record, title didn't show it as paid off and reconveyed, but that happens all the time. And that's why Laura just posted, if you guys look in the chat, that there's a training coming up with Pacific Escrow and with Michelle from Fidelity about how to read a prelim and what red flags to look for, which is what we just talked about, which means all of you should be at that class. And that is on March 25th at 11:30. So there you go. Be there. Okay. So the seller's going to sign that because they answered those questions. Okay. Next, agent's inspection disclosure. Now, we in this office require the AVID. The state of California does not require the AVID. The AVID is just an available document for you to use to make your visual inspection disclosure easier. And that was going to be the next thing we talked about, but I'm long-winded and we're not going to get there. So that's where we'll start on next Thursday. So you have a choice. I can see attached agent visual inspection here and check the box. I could say agent notes no item for disclosure, which is ridiculous. Please don't ever do that. Or an agent could say, I note the following items. Now, this is not what you put. Did I spell recommends wrong? Never, ever, ever should I see that. And I think I can't, man, my spelling is getting worse as I get older. Never should that be in your visual inspection section. Never on an AVID, never in this TDS. That's, Joe once in a while will say that's professional misconduct. That's professional misconduct. This section is for you to make note of the items that you found, the defects that you found doing a diligent visual inspection. That's what goes here. So you're to list things. That's why we make the AVID a requirement, because then we know that at least there's some record of you making a note. Now, some of the AVIDs I see from you guys, as much training as we've done and the people that we've had, right, where we've had, Robert Brand comes in here and does those very detailed about what you should and shouldn't write in your AVID. Some of the AVIDs that I see are crazy to me. So, but we're going to talk about the AVID next week. But this is why I say it's so important for your AVID to get done as soon as possible, and generally before the TDS, or while you've gone over the TDS, maybe have the seller start working on it. You could review it and do your visual inspection at the same time they're answering the questions, and then you guys could sit down and go over their TDS, get them to complete it and finish off the TDS. But now what happens is your AVID is technically part of the transfer disclosure statement. So if I haven't done an avid, even though I check off this box that says see attached avid, and then I do it at the close of escrow, like a lot of agents choose to do, they do their avid whenever they're like, oh, I'll do it some point before we close. That's not how it works. Your avid is part of this transaction. And if the seller is supposed to deliver this TDS 7 days after acceptance, and for the buyer to review a complete disclosure statement, that means your avid has to be done within the first 7 days. It has to be done in the first 7 days, so that when that TDS comes in and you check the box that says see attached visual inspection right down here for the buyer's agent, then you have a complete TDS that you're handing over to your buyers, that you're reviewing with your buyers. So as soon as you get acceptance, you should be making arrangements to go back to that property and do your avid. And as Robert Brand has discussed with us many times, do not do your avid while you're doing the professional home inspection, because now you're opening yourself up to disclosing some things or not disclosing things that you may or may not have seen in a normal visual inspection. And we'll talk about those things next Thursday. We're going to go through the avid next Thursday and the SPQ and some other things. So everybody signs, seller, buyer sign, agent, the listing agent signs, buyer's agent signs. That is now a complete form. How late can I do my avid? You have to do your avid as soon as possible, which means you should be doing it within the 7 days. Your avid should be done. Okay, so let's say that you can't do it in the 7 days. Your avid should be completed prior to your buyer reviewing disclosures. That's it. That's your latest. Whatever the date is that your buyer is going to look at the TDS, that's the latest your avid should be completed. Okay. All right. I'm going to stop sharing right now. Anybody else have any questions about anything we discussed today or anything that's on your mind that you need assistance with? Anybody? No. All right. So we're going to continue disclosures next Thursday. I had a feeling that the TDS was going to take us the entire class. The avid next week, we're going to go through a little quicker so that we can get to the SPQ and a couple other items. I really appreciate you guys being here. I hope to see you all again next Thursday as we continue this discussion. Please go out there, be professional, be productive, and take care of yourselves, and I'll see you soon.